So I have some slides on the dynamic and constraint models and model building and all that, but then also today I kind of reflected a bit about the meeting we had yesterday and generally like the cortical column structure and how it kind of maps on the algorithm we implement right now. But I'm a bit scared to talk about it because I feel like I might have gotten something totally wrong and you all think I'm really stupid and don't understand anything. So I don't...
Don't you realize I've gotten over that fear long ago?
Yeah, I feel
I preface everything I say like I could be totally wrong. So you just say that and then you're good.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, if you want to humor me and hear my thoughts on that in the slide.
Well, it's up to you, but I wouldn't not talk about something for fear of embarrassment.
Yeah, no, yeah, I try to kind of take that being afraid of doing something as a signal that I should do it because that's when I'll learn the most. Okay, yeah, I can show really briefly kind of what I was thinking. So this will also map onto kind of the drawing I'm going to show next with the object models and kind of having these location representations. But basically the idea being we have a movement signal coming in down here. We have the movement gets applied to different possible locations in the object's reference frame that we might be in. And then these locations in the object reference frame, the neurons that represent those kind of project upwards. And they project to neurons up here, which for one get this kind of location input, which is a very strong driver for the activity of this neuron. And I know this is a super strong abstraction saying that like this is basically like a cup outline and each point on the cup is a neuron representing it. But this is
it didn't catch that. It looked like a random bit field.
Yeah, sorry, it's supposed to be like a cup outline.
Now I see it. Now you can't see it. No, you can't.
This is the secret to the cortical computation. If you do slices through the cortex, you'll just see like 2D models of the objects.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's a strong abstraction, but basically saying, okay, so this location on the cup, it gets strongly activated if that location in the cup's reference frame gets activated, but it also has like dendrites, and these dendrites get the feature input, and the incoming features can kind of prime this point on the mark to become active. So if the features match, this neuron will respond faster, and then once we kind of have a strong one of these responds very strongly, it kind of projects upward and represents the object ID and location on the object. And just like this is kind of my interpretation. I don't know if you'd agree, Jeff, of like the hierarchy aspect then. So basically this column would be a column on the second level in the hierarchy. So that would be LM3 that we had up here.
Well, it didn't have to be. It didn't have to be, right? This could also have been 0, 1, and 2, right?
It wouldn't have to be. This is just an example now.
Yeah.
So in this example, that basically the raw sensory input that goes in here as features. So everything that goes onto this dendrite is coming in here from the side as the features. But basically LM0, which is at the center of this receptive field, and its larger receptive field itself, kind of attached to the dendrite closer to the soma, while LM1 and LM2, which are more here on the outside of the receptive field, would attach kind of further out on the dendritic branch. And if we get the input from LM0, this is kind of already enough to prime the cell to fire, but so we don't really need to like input from LM1 or 2 doesn't really matter that much anymore. But if we don't get anything from LM0, these might kind of still be able to have an effect on whether the neuron fires.
That's what I talked about the other day. That's a good picture of it. Although, just remind yourselves, I made that up. So although there are many places in the brain where this sort of segregation along the dendrite, how far away is from the soma, does exist. We know that exists. We know it exists in the thalamus and other places. So it's not a crazy idea, but I had no evidence specific. Actually, there's data on this we could find out for layer 4 cells, but that does capture what I speculated, although that wasn't like, oh yeah, this is the way it is. It was more like, well, it could be like this. So yes, that reflects my speculation.
Okay, cool. That's really great to hear. Because then
Now,
that kind of also solves the problem that LM0, 1, and 2 don't need to represent the object ID with the same pattern. So like the SDR that represents the logo pattern doesn't have to be the same for all of these. It just needs to be that this dendrite detects the pattern for a logo here, here, and here, but it doesn't need to be necessarily the exact same pattern.
If you think about it, if you think about 1 and 2 and 0, these are all separate neurons in these columns. And it's actually meaningless to say they have the same pattern. It's like they're separate inputs. There's no one ever looking to see that there's the same pattern, unless you somehow combine those axons that they join together somehow. So I just want to point out that it's kind of meaningless to say they have the same SDR. So they don't, which is good. From a machine learning point of view, you can say, oh yeah, this is the same representation, but from a neuron point of view, these are separate populations of neurons, and they don't know what the other ones are doing. And so, anyway, that's good. There's a big addition to this diagram, which at some point I should point out, but I'm not sure if you're done with it yet.
Yeah, I have another few additions to it. Do you mean to the left or the right diagram?
Well, I'm thinking about the left diagram.
Okay, yeah, so that one is definitely still like, I would add like the top-down input and voting, but yeah.
No, there's another big one.
Yeah.
And remember, we've kind of separated out morphology from features. I mean, this is a kind of deduce this has to happen.
Yeah.
And so remember, if you think about V1, in layer 4, where you show the dots for the coffee cup, the predominant cell property that people report about are, edges at orientations, right? And so the mini columns in that layer 4, there's a whole bunch of cells in the mini column that all respond to the same edge orientation, and the next mini column over is a different edge orientation, and so on. And so the speculation, well, it's speculation, but it also fits very well, is that there's two things going on in layer 4. One is a mini column is detecting, in some sense, your point normal, the edge of the object, the edge of the thing. And that in some sense, if you just imagine there's a series of cells all vertically aligned that all represent one point normal and another point normal. And what happens when you get these features coming in or on a specific object, on a specific location on a specific object, it picks one of those cells in the mini column. So in some sense, you have a representation of the edge of the object, the point normal of the object, which is defining its morphology. And then we want to represent that uniquely on a particular object. So if I just have the edge coming in, I don't know what object I'm on, so I activate all those cells in the mini column. But if I have more data, and if I know where I am, or I have some additional information, I can narrow it down. So the theory here is that there's sort of two things driving layer 4. One is this sort of predominant edge detection system, and then within the cells in the mini column, they get this input from the movement grid you show down, the reference frames. They also get features, and so that way those help us determine, okay, we've got this edge, we got this point normal or this edge of the object, and which cells should we activate in the mini column to represent, a set of mini columns, which cells in one in each of the active mini columns should we activate to represent the specific object's edge? And that would be determined by the features and the location. So that way we want to be able to recognize the object purely by morphology, and we also want to be able to narrow it down by specific features or knowing specific locations. If I know where I am on what object, then I always activate a specific cell in the mini column. Does that sound familiar? Because we've talked about it in the past. I know it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure if I got everything, but basically, so here in this diagram, we can recognize the object without ever getting feature input, just from like how the locations get activated in the object's reference frame. But then also like we get morphological features as input here, like the point normal and the curvature.
But the morphological features are, I assume that the morphological features are always, well, that's the base thing. You get that. That's what's detected primarily by the retina in some sense. And then if there's additional information, whether it's a feature from another region, another column, a module, or if it's a color or something like that, it helps us narrow down. It's just a temporal memory algorithm. We have a set of mini columns which represent the current, at some location, this is the current point normal in some sense, right? At some point, some locations, okay, I can think of more like the edge of the object is pointing up or sideways or horizontal or something. But then we want to, that's generic, that's not specific to a particular object. And we want to eventually get to a particular object. And then we want to pick a unique cell in each mini column that's active. And then now it's say, oh, this is the horizontal edge on a coffee cup versus the horizontal edge on the, the stapler or something like that. I could draw a diagram, but I can't do it here. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Yeah, I wouldn't know concretely how to modify this diagram to incorporate that. So if you can draw something sometime and send it or so, that would be
I could try to do that. Maybe send me a reminder of that so I don't forget to do it. I got so many things going on. Yeah, just to give you a little bit more flavor of this, it looks like in the brain, there are two sets of cells that are getting these inputs from the retina. There's the cells you've drawn here, which are just these layer 4 cells that everyone reports about. But then there's these other cells, which I've talked about in the past, which seem to drive a mini column. They activate all the cells in the mini column together, or and that's it. They sort of drive all the cells in the mini column together. These are these bipolar cells. There's not as many of them, but so in one sense, those cells detect, these bipolar cells are actually detecting the point normal, and they inhibit one another so that they form, not a very sparse distribution, but it's not super sparse. It's like there's maybe 10 different angles your edge could be at, and then and so those drive all the cells that you've shown here as a group. They say, oh, here's a bunch of cells that represent this edge, and then here's another bunch of cells that represent different angles to the edge, and so on. And then we want to pick a unique cell in that mini column, in each of the active mini columns, and that forms a unique representation of that point normal for a specific object. So I can try drawing that. Just if you could just send me a reminder to do that, I can try to do that. But we did conclude, or I concluded that it's so surprisingly that we need to have these two representations. We have to have one that's sort of representing the morphology of the object, and then one represent additional features that may help us. And those additional features could be the location, or they could be the color, or they could be projections from 0 or 1 or 2, that kind of thing.
Yeah. But the morphology would also be represented in this layer, and we kind of also move in the same location reference frame through that.
I have to think about the details of this. I haven't thought through the details of it yet. But just imagine there's two cell populations. There's one of these bipolar cells that represent the point normal, and there's another, and then each of those is a set of other cells which are used to represent the point normal uniquely. Yeah. And how all that works, I don't know. But I
I'm
think
trying to remember. I think in the by the bay last one we had some diagrams we drew where we had the kind of feature and morphology layers separate. And I can't remember exactly what the sort of anatomical correspondence was, but
I think we had a separate
definitely
feature.
tried to separate them.
I think in the
Yeah.
top layer, the ID, we had two different output IDs, one for the morphology and one for the features as
Right,
well.
that could make sense. So again, imagine there's these two populations of cells. Remember yesterday, and I've talked about all this before, but I know it's a lot. It could easily get forgotten. Yesterday, I pointed out there were actually 3 different locations in a column that get input from the sensor. I said that the one that everyone talks about is the layer 4 cells. Those are your dots here. And the other 2 were at the border of the bottom of layer 3 and at the bottom of layer 5. And what I'm thinking here is it's possible that the one that comes in at the bottom of layer 3, and this isn't critical, but I'm thinking along the lines of what if that drove the mini columns, that those connected to the bipolar cells, and so that's driving the morphology, and then the other ones connect to the directly to the layer 4 cells, and that would explain all this, right?
I kind of thought that the ones at the bottom of layer 3 would detect object movement and then
right. I did say that.
Shift the object location.
Right. That is a that was a speculation I proposed, but it may not be inconsistent with what I just said either. So I'll have to think about it a lot more.
Okay.
But there clearly is these bipolar cells. Let me give you tell you a little bit about them. I don't know if you remember what they look like. They're like, they call them, sometimes they used to call them in the old days, they call them like horsetails, because they're like the axons and dendrites of these cells are just very fine bundles that are very narrowly constrained, like 50 microns wide or something, and they really define the mini column, and they span up and down. Those cells, those bipolar cells, actually they get direct input from the retina. We know that. We also know that they have the same basic edge response properties as people have reported in the layer 4 cells. So we also know that they fire earlier than the layer 4 cells, that they're quicker. That could be because they're getting input from the magnocellular pathway, or it could be because they are just faster responding. So we don't know the details of this, but it's totally consistent that the input comes in. The first thing that happens is okay, I've detected my edge of this object. I know what orientation it is. Now I'm going to see if I can pick a specific representation for that. It is possible that the bipolar cells are actually temporal pooled as well. And therefore they might be more of a class object, right? They would say, yeah, forget the details here. This is a cylinder or a coffee cup. I'm not really paying attention to the bipolar cells wouldn't know that there's a logo or that it's green or something like that. It's just that I could just, basically the bipolar cells themselves could be pooled in some sense to create a morphology model. There's problems with this, so I'm just throwing these ideas out, but it's not worked through.
Yeah,
I found the notes from what we discussed by the bay. So yeah, what I've got written here was so there was 2 possibilities discussed, one was dendritic branches on L4 cells could receive parvocellular input, which might be processing non-morphological features, so like color. And then the somatic inputs via intermediary bipolar cells could be providing morphological features. That's where it's 2 different parts of the cell. The other one that was discussed was the non-morphological bias might, and this could maybe be in addition, be received and represented by stellate rather than pyramidal cells in L4. So then L4 would be kind of a combined code changing as a function of space for morphological features, which is in the pyramidal cells, and non-morphological features in the stellate cells.
Oh, yeah,
Both
that's
bound
right.
to locations via layer 6.
Right. I forgot about that part. Yeah.
And then we might then pool over this combined L4 representation to develop a combined stable representation in L2-3.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Those are good ideas. I think we want to get off this topic so you can get back to what you want to present, Viviane. But there's a lot of the traditional neuroscientists just they detect these edges in these layer 4 cells in anesthetized animals or animals that are not looking at an object. They are really just, they're just giving sinusoidal waves and so on. And in that case, the pyramidal cells and the stellate cells would all look like they're edge detectors. But when those same cells, and this has been shown, those same cells, when the animal is looking at a real object that the animal knows, they become much sparser and the cells become unique to the object. Those are the object, what's it called? The object edge. There's a name for them. I forget what they use. Anyway.
Oh, you mean like kind of like a border ownership cell almost?
That was it. Border ownership cells. Right. So a border ownership cell is exactly what we were just talking about. It's a cell that when you're looking at not looking at an object, it's just you got some raw input coming in. Oh, the animal's anesthetized. It says, oh, this is just an edge detector. And then, but in the context of a real object, in an alert animal, they become much sparser, and that cell becomes selective to particular objects at particular locations on those objects. And it's exactly what we're just talking about. So very strong evidence that this sort of sparsification of the edge is occurring. It's been observed in the border ownership cells. I'll try to work through a diagram of this if I can. I've done it in the past, but I haven't done it in a while.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, I think it's what's going on, but the details are complicated.
Yeah.
Okay. That was the additional. That was a pretty important addition to your diagram, but I'm not sure where you're going next, so it may not be important for the discussion today.
Yeah, just let me add a few more small things in here and then we can move on. So basically, one thing now related to what we do in the code as well is that we have certain rotation hypotheses for the object, and we kind of need to use these rotation hypotheses to transform the movement that we get in body-centric coordinates into the object's reference frame. So that might be happening in the thalamus, for example, that we get the displacement coming in of how the sensor moves relative to the body, and then we kind of rotate this displacement depending on how we think the object might be rotated. And then that gets into this object's reference frame, and then we can use it to activate the next location in that reference frame and activate the neurons up here. That's one addition in here. And then the second thing is to kind of keep track of what the possible locations are. We would kind of need another connections going from layer 4 down here, because at the beginning we could be anywhere on the object, but then through movement and through getting features and successive movement, we kind of want to eliminate a lot of the locations in this object's reference frame. So we only want to keep the ones active that are still consistent with the movement and features that we saw.
By the way, I don't think it's layer 5. I think it's layer 6 we're talking about here.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah, let me change that.
I think all the data would suggest that layer 6 is tracking orientation and location.
Okay.
Right. So we have speculated that this is done through unions that get narrowed down. I think that's part of the solution. Maybe it's not the complete solution, but it's part of the solution.
Yeah. And then I guess an open question for me would be how this system would keep track of the possible rotations. So like the rotation hypotheses that go down here, and then how they get narrowed down and kind of
Yeah.
associated with the different paths in this reference frame. I mean, in the code, it's easy to do, but I'm just not sure yet how it would be done in this neural framework. That like multiple maybe there could be multiple neurons representing each of the locations in this reference frame, and then they could each be associated with a different rotation. And then whichever ones are still active get sent down here as a signal for the thalamus to rotate the displacement. Yeah, they are not sure.
I don't know if you're going to show this, but the blue arrow that's talking about features, that also has to be rotated, right? That
yeah, so yeah, here I
there
actually
you go.
updated this
Okay.
diagram that this.
I figure you're going to put it in there. You just stopped short. I'm like, why did you stop short?
Yeah, I noticed it too late. I had already exported the figure, but then I
Okay.
did
Okay.
it. So yeah,
Fine.
this also goes through the rotation, like the morphological features, like the point normals, also need to be rotated, like you say.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, kind of the top-down object ID and pose from a higher level learning module would, for one, go onto the dendritic branches of the neurons up here that kind of recognize the object or represent the object ID. And then these neurons would send out the lateral voting connections. And then somehow this could also, influence the location neurons here. If the top high level learning module recognizes an object location and pose, it can kind of reinforce some of these location neurons as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because if we're on the coffee cup, a specific location, and there's a logo at that point, there was a coincident location in the upper module and a location in the lower module. And so in theory, the top down could re-invoke the specific location that you were on the logo at that point in time. And that's why that lower arrow could come across there.
Yeah.
One thing I talked about multiple times that you didn't show here, but, and I don't know if this is right or not, but it seems like it should be right, is I've been arguing that there's these two layers, 6 cells, A and B, that have these very parallel weird organizations. I showed that figure from the Thompson paper yesterday, and they seem to be like, yin and yang, 6A and 6B. And I have been working on somehow the hypothesis that one's representing location, like a grid cell, and one's representing orientation, like head direction cells. And I say that because both need to go through path integration. Both, like, some movements will just change your orientation and some movements will change your location. And so we need to update both of those based on our movement. And so there might be two sort of gritty things down below. You're just showing location, but there might be, I'm working on the hypothesis that there's a set of cells that represent location, a set of cells that represent orientation. They're very similar. They're both sort of a movement updated, path integrated population of cells. And the one that represents orientation is the one that's sent back to the thalamus, because that's the one that helps us rotate the things. The other one would be sent up to the layer 4 cells. And this is inconsistent with the data, so I'm still trying to make this work, but this general idea that there's these two populations down there, location and orientation, seems to be like worthy of pursuit.
Yeah, definitely let me know if you make some conceptual progress on that, because that's like my big question mark down here still, like how is this represented? I mean, here the rotation hypothesis, I just started this error in the middle of nowhere. I don't really have an idea of how this plays into how this would be represented. So yeah, if you have some.
Well, imagine I had a system that its only job was to figure out orientation, like its only job was to figure out your head direction. Well, I would have a set of cells that are updated just like grid cells. The same basic mechanism would work. I basically get a movement vector. In this case, the movement vector would be like, you're turning your eyes left, you're turning your eyes right, you're lifting your eyes up, you're lifting your eyes down. It's like you're not moving through space, you're just scanning left and right, up and down, or turning or rotating in plane. But it's not it's not a movement forward or backwards. It's just changing the position of the eye in some location space. I could break a mechanism that would look just like this. I would say, oh, I have a movement vector coming in. I have a representation of my current orientation. And when the movement vector comes in, I want to do path integration to predict the next orientation. I'll use sensory feedback to lock in the correct orientation because my path integration is noisy. It's totally analogous to what we think is going on with grid cells in location. So I think having two representations that are very, very similar, one for orientation, one for location, makes sense. And I will have to set some time to think about that, but I can try to do it today and see if I make some progress on it.
Yeah,
One
It's
thing
a
that's
big
also
project.
really, yes, sorry if you mentioned this already, but just with the top-down feedback, I guess, yeah, if that's influencing the apical branches, then that impacts both L2, L3, and L4.
Well, L4 generally, layer 4 does not have, well, layer 4 does not send apical dendrites up to layer 1. In fact, the stellate cells have no apical dendrite at all.
Oh, yeah,
So,
sorry, L5.
L5, it impacts L5 and
Oh, yeah,
layer
just
2.
if
5,
we
3, and
want to
2 are the
consider
two.
that.
Right.
in the diagram.
But we don't understand that. I think that's the motor cells, right? And I don't know why it's doing that. And so it makes me wonder, like what are L5 cells really doing? They are motor related, but we don't really know exactly what they're doing. And maybe somehow the representation in L5 is also incorporating, movement relative to the state of the object. Is the stapler open or closed? I mean, there's some mysteries here. So yeah, that's a mystery. It's pretty easy to understand layer 2 and 3. They get this feedback and says, oh, here's the object you're on. Great. Invoke that object, and it's easy. It's actually not too hard to understand the lower projection, which you show here going into layer 6, because that could say, oh, at this location, not only this object, but you're at this location on the object, and at this orientation, the object has this orientation. So it just helps this lower module lock in exactly what it's supposed to be predicting. What the layer 5 cells are getting feedback from, this has to do with our hierarchical action policy, and I have no idea. So that's a mystery to me.
Yeah, for me, this was kind of like one of the eye-opening moments, like, because when I thought about how this projects to what we want to solve and all, these are exactly the two locations where we would need the top-down signal. So it's really nice that matches up.
Yeah, in fact, and I feel bad for a while. I pushed back on this, telling it. I said, "Oh, it's not going to tell you anything about the location," but then I forgot about that lower projection. So yes, it can.
Yeah. So
okay, I'll try to take this diagram and make a more elaborate version of it. See if I can do it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I hope this wasn't. I mean, maybe nothing in here was really new. I just kind of had to frame it for myself.
No, it's great to have the diagram. The diagram helps us all, me too, think about it and say, oh, yeah, right. That's what it looks.
Okay, cool.
One quick thing on your previous slide, so if that's okay. Just Jeff, when we were sorry, the slide before. This one.
Oops, this one.
This one, sorry, yeah. Yeah, Jeff, when we were talking about this earlier today, Viviane, we were talking about the back propagating action potentials, and I was just trying to remember what those do and how that could be relevant to all this, because isn't that is that something where they actually suppress the sort of more distal inputs?
No, not suppress it, no.
Okay.
So do you want me to review that? I can just talk about what we know about that.
I guess the practical question was, if all LM0, 1, and 2, they all produce an output, does kind of this cell still consider anything from LM1 and 2 if it has already gotten good input from LM0, or does like the LM0 input kind of suppress the inputs from those two?
Well, let's talk about learning and back action potentials, right? The basic theory about back action potential is a cell spikes, and then that spike travels back up the dendrites as well as down the axon. But the back action potential is not as strong, and it doesn't travel to the end of the dendrite. As a general rule, it doesn't do that, where an action potential will always travel to the end of the axon. But if, imagine you show 4 locations on that dendrite that received input. The evidence suggests that if an NMDA spike was generated on the dendrite, and so that an NMDA spike could travel to the soma then spikes, the back action potential will travel back further to the point where the NMDA spike was generated. So there's a lot of evidence that says if the dendrite was depolarized with like an NMDA spike, that primes it for sending the back action potential back to that site. So what that says is we want to train the synapses. We want to train the synapses that were predictive of the cell spiking. And so we could, without knowing exactly, we could just say, in this case, if let's say LM0 was the only one that actually generated a spike, an NMDA spike, well, then those synapses would be reinforced. If LM1 also generated an NMDA spike, well, the back action potential would go back there and reinforce those synapses. So any input that was predictive would, meaning they generated an NMDA spike right before the action potential, they would get reinforced. And inputs along the dendrite that didn't generate an NMDA spike, there'll be lots of those. There's lots of synapses active along the dendrite that don't generate an NMDA spike. They do not get reinforced. So that's part of the question you had there. The cell would reinforce anything that led to its prediction, that correctly predicted its activity.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. Thanks. Yeah, that is different from what I had thought, but no, that makes sense.
You know, in terms of what happens when, if these different points generate NMDA spikes at different points, I don't really know what would happen. I guess it depends on the order they come in, and I don't know what would happen there. The default assumption is that we can just any NMDA spike is as good as any other. So if any one of these things contributed, then that's good. But it might be more complicated than that.
Okay, should I move on to the next topic, or is there some more on this?
No, sounds good.
Okay, cool. So
it only took us a week to get to this point.
Yeah, I originally made like 3 slides about the connectivity and thought I'll just quickly go over it and double check with everyone, and it turned into like 3 meetings or something like that.
My fault, sorry.
Yeah, I guess now I definitely have a lot better understanding. So it was not wasted time. Okay, so regarding the models, I started with just kind of sitting down and thinking about what we want from the models, because my plan was to kind of rewrite the code for the object models and redesign it so it has more properties that we want, and also so it's a bit more useful for hierarchy. And so what we want is the model should be fast to update and fast to search. We have a limited storage capacity, so large detailed model is decomposed into smaller detailed part models. We can't just store a huge model at infinite amount of detail, but we kind of need hierarchy for that and composition.
Can I just a slight word thing? When I hear the word limited, it sounds like it's small. And that's not what we're saying. We're saying it's fixed, right? I used to often use the word fixed. I just wanted to be clear that we all agree to the same, what we mean by limited. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't have much storage. It has a lot of storage. There's hundreds of millions of synapses here. So there's a lot of storage, but it's limited in the sense that it can't keep expanding. It's limited in the sense that there's a limit, not that it's small. So I just wanted to clarify about that.
Yeah.
Yes, and a module can't learn everything, obviously, but it can learn a fair amount. It's just it has a limit.
Yeah,
That's what you
and
mean.
not just limited in the amount, but also like in the size. Like if I understood it right, like the lower level modules learn more models of small objects, like a small letter A, and then higher up you can learn like
Right.
lower
Well,
resolution models
that's
of large
I wouldn't call
objects.
that. I wouldn't say that's a limitation. I would, you could argue that's a strength of the smaller module, the lower module. So it's just a difference. The modules,
Yeah,
we could assume for starters that the columns in V1 and V2 and V4 all have the same capacity.
yeah,
That may not be true, but we could start with that.
yeah,
There's some evidence that suggests that as you go up the hierarchy, that the column size of the learning modules actually get larger, meaning they have more neural tissue in them. But that is not clear. It's not, the evidence of that is kind of mixed. So I throw that into like, oh, it is possible that a higher module could have more capacity than a lower module.
okay.
But
Yeah, I seem to remember finding a paper a while ago that it was V1 and V2 that could have like on average 150 cells per like yeah, basically like 1.5 times as many cells as higher level ones. But
as a column,
yeah,
really?
in a mini column, I think.
Oh, in a
But
mini
let
column. Oh,
me
that's
double check that.
all right. So, look, there's different capacities here, right? There's the total number of
Right.
cells in the column. There's the number of mini columns. There's the number of
Yeah,
cells
okay.
per mini column, right? So yeah, I think we could, here's the way I view it. The system ought to work no matter what capacity we give any one of these modules. It should work. It might work better if some learning modules in different parts of the hierarchy have more of one type of capacity and less of another, or something like that. So it's totally, it really, to me, it's data driven. It depends on what the nature of the world is. And so, but that's just a parameter, that's a hyperparameter that optimizes things, but it doesn't change fundamentally how it works.
Yeah, and speaking of it being data driven, we want the models to kind of learn statistical regularities in the world and not just store every random variation that we once encountered, but more kind of learn what's kind of consistent. And then, yeah, we want the models to efficiently cover the whole object. Maybe we want to represent the concept of surface. We want to be
Is
able
that the same? That's our morphology.
yeah, it's basically saying that you kind of move along a surface, but you don't move inside the surface or off the surface.
Oh, you're talking about then that's an action policy.
Yeah, it's an action policy where that kind of information is stored in the model or associated with the model.
Oh, okay. Okay.
We want to be able to associate features from different input channels, so from learning modules or sensor modules. We want to be able to...
Again, the solution was seeking says the learning module doesn't know.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't know where these things are.
Yeah, but it should be able to receive input from both.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then different feature and morphology maps. It would be nice if they can be associated with each other, so that we can have the morphology of a mug, but the mug can have different textures on it or different logos or whatever. And then that's a bit out in the future, that maybe the feature and morphology maps can be state conditioned, so we can represent object states and behaviors.
That is a total mystery to me still. Like every time I think about it, my head explodes. It's like, I just share some of my confusion about this. It's like if I imagine, I think of a model as a set of locations that are unique to the object, right? So we form a sparse representation of the locations, and so there's unique representations of the object. And the question now, if I have an object with behaviors, it's changing its morphology like a stapler. There's multiple ways that can happen. I don't understand them. One way you could say, oh, it's all in the same spatial map. I've just moved to a different point of my location space where I'm representing something. It could be like I remap it's like I form a new object. It's like, this is no longer the stapler. This is the stapler in the open position. Or it could be, I don't know what it is, but it's really hard for me to imagine how this works. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but if the incoming displacement that we get in here, if we are able to kind of add another transform on top of it, we could kind of state condition the object by saying transform the displacements in this way, and that way, like, no, I guess that doesn't make sense.
That would be moving in the same location space, like,
yeah.
Yeah,
no, it doesn't make sense now that I think about it, because it would have to be different depending on where on the object we are.
The other possibility, maybe the most likely possibility, is something like a stapler, is as soon as it starts moving, we stop thinking about it as one thing, and we start thinking, oh, there's two parts of the stapler, and they're separate objects, and now we're learning the relative displacements of those two objects. And so,
Yeah.
but I don't know, it's still confusing to me. Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna tackle that last one. I'm mostly looking at those three here. So kind of
Which three?
Oh,
right there, I got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically adding some fixed, not limited, fixed parameters to these models to enforce learning statistical subparts of objects. And kind of how I'm doing this is to have three constraints. So two are shown here. One is the maximum model size. So here are just some examples. So for example, it could say like this learning module can learn.
You're thinking physical size here.
Yeah, physical size in the world.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
like saying this learning module can learn objects of up to 10 cubic centimeters.
Yeah.
And then the second one is a number of cells per dimension. So for example, in this drawing, it would be 4. So it'd be 4 by 4 by 4 cells. Each cell covers a space of 2 cubic centimeters. And then, so that would be, so the maximum model size would kind of constrain the spatial coverage. How large can the objects be that are modeled? The number of cells per dimension would constrain the spatial resolution. So how high of a resolution can we represent of this object? And then the third constraint is maximum nodes per graph. So basically, the most statistically regular cells are going to be like, they cross like a node permanence threshold, and then they're going to be used for matching. And however many top K winners we pick here kind of defines the model complexity. And then here are just some pictures that I showed last week already. But just to recap, so this is the graphs we have right now. They're totally unconstrained. We can learn as large objects as we want, as detailed as we want. And then these are the new constrained objects. So the top row kind of shows a larger, a cell that can learn larger objects. So here it covers the entire mug, while the bottom row kind of can only learn smaller objects. So here it only learns part of the mug. And then, for example, the difference between this one and this one is that this one has more cells per dimension, so it can represent a more detailed spatial resolution. And then this one over here has a smaller K, so we pick less.
What's K?
So that's the number of winner cells that we pick. Basically looking at which points were visited the most often, and then the ones that were seen most often in the world, kind of looking at the statistical regularities. those will become permanent and will be used for matching, for recognizing the mug. And if we set
And-
k smaller, we kind of just really look at the ones that were very frequently visited.
The one in the middle and the top row, I mean, that one has both more cells and more K than the one on the left, right? Because so the cells is the granularity, whereas the K is like how many nodes there are, or like how many points in the graph, right?
Yeah.
Seems like
Uh,
there's more points.
Yeah, it might. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it might be also a larger K.
I don't know if I feel so yeah, I feel like whenever I kind of look at this or kind of when I was reviewing the code, I was often getting confused. I think partly the term cell, just because it's so like it's such an overloaded term.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's I can't necessarily think of a better term, like voxel or something like that. Maybe
Yeah, voxel is a good idea.
Oh, I see. It's not a biological type of cell or a neural network cell.
No,
You're saying
yeah,
it's
it's just supposed to be like one of those
it's a
subcubes.
volume of space.
Yeah,
Right? So,
yeah.
but like even if it's not biological, like yeah, it can still feel like it's referring to like the nodes itself and not
Yeah,
the space in which they lie or something.
voxel is a good idea, I think. I should change that. Yeah, so moving on, I will just visualize it in 2D because it's easier to draw.
Yeah.
It's a bit difficult to draw points in a 3D cube, but obviously in the implementation, this is in 3D because we deal with 3D objects. But basically the statistical regularity idea is we have a bunch of observations in space, that these are the gray points here, and each of them falls into one of these voxels. And then we count up how many of these points fall into the voxels, and the ones that have the K voxels with the most observations in them will become permanent nodes in the graph that is used for recognizing the object. And then, yeah, I kind of tried to draw this general idea in a bit of a biological analogy, I guess. I don't know if it makes any sense, but so I was thinking of it as, let's say we would have a set of grid cell modules, and together they can uniquely encode these different locations. So they can't distinguish between locations within each of these voxels, but they can distinguish between all of these voxels. Once we go out of this grid, the representations kind of repeat themselves. So everything in here are the locations that can uniquely be encoded. And then when we move in the world, we kind of learn associations between these uniquely encoded locations and observed features. And depending on how often we saw these features at these locations, we have different strength of associations. And after applying K-winners, we basically make the strongest associations permanent. And those will then be used for when I'm trying to recognize a new object. And then over time, if I now see the handle being more bent very often, we can kind of form new connections to wherever we see these new statistical regularities. Does that kind of make sense?
You mentioned the repeating of once you go outside of this grid. So did you end up implementing this kind of wraparound thing?
No. So I think it doesn't make. We talked about implementing that it actually wraps around, but I think it doesn't make sense. And I think how I'm kind of explaining this away is that we would have like one grid cell module or whatever that just recognizes whether we're in that field or not in that field. So it's like a huge resolution. And only when we are in that field, it kind of passes up the location. So
okay. I have a bunch of thoughts, but I'll keep waiting, I guess. Unless you want me to jump in now. Let me let me
Yeah,
just
no,
comment
go
on
ahead.
this particular thing about the wraparound. Any grid cell module wraps around, but a set of them, it takes a long time for you to get the same representation again. Like, it could be like practically infinite. So it's in the neural representation of location. My assumption's always been that you can go really, really far in distance, like, and not have a repeating your location. That's
Even
not
if
a
we just have
limitation.
like 3 of those, for example.
Well, yeah, I think you need more than 3. You need a bunch because you need to form an SDR of them. So,
What
so
I think the thing is, yeah, they do repeat but not so much within a single object, but more if you've learned multiple objects, then I mean that's when
well,
you get the repetition, right?
let's say I have. I'm working on the assumption it's not actually grid cells themselves, but it's these one-dimensional grid cells, these movement vector cells. And let's say there are each one of those dimensions has 10 or 20 positions, let's say. And so if I have 20 of these vectors and 20 positions, then the representational space is what would it be? I have to think about that. I'm outside and it's confusing me. It's quite large. I mean, we're probably talking billions or something like that. So I actually think from a practical point of view, we don't have to think about space being limited. The problem is that when you imagine I have some space I've defined, and it's let's lay it down in physical words. Let's say the distance between points in this space that I can represent uniquely as a centimeter. Well, I could have a point cloud of let's say a billion locations, and that's a really big space. And so the problem isn't that we're limited. The problem is if I start moving, the resolution of my space becomes sort of noise on larger objects. So if I have a very large object, let's say a building, and I'm trying to represent locations on a centimeter point by point, then there's just too much noise in the system for the locations to be very meaningful. Like I can't path integrate with any reliability, moving 20 yards or 20 meters if my resolution is a centimeter. It becomes meaningless at that point. So I view it more of a sort of a statistical noise problem, that you can't get too big because path integration stops working and your models are not that precise. And so it's not the representational problem of the neurons. It's really just the noise of the way the system works and the statistics of it, that trying to represent a house at a centimeter resolution is technically doable on a computer, but in a brain it ain't gonna happen. It's just too much noise in that system. So that's how I view it. I'm not sure you shouldn't do it the way you're doing it here. I'm not
Yeah, I
suggesting
mean, I'm not
dangerous.
actually implementing grid cell modules or something. I just kind of wanted to try and make an analogy.
Right.
I guess the main
Right.
idea is just that we have a set of uniquely encoded locations, and they are kind of spatially limited and also limited in their resolution.
Yeah.
But
Right.
how that
I'm
is
just saying-
implemented is like, I'm not
Right.
saying
But
it's like
I wouldn't do anything that says relies on the fact that there's like some hard edge to your representational space. And if you take one step further, you're going to get, a repeated location. That's not going to be true. You can say, yeah, I'm going to sort of limit the size of my models here, but it's not limited by the fact that I start repeating locations. There's other limits. So I just don't make that.
Yeah, and I guess it would be probably random where it does repeat. Like
it'd be so far out in space that you just don't even have to think about it. It's just like, yeah. If you have enough of these modules, even like 20, and each one has 20 locations, it's a very, very 20 possible, it's like, well, it's It would be, let's say it would be 400, choose 20. What's that number? You can type that into Google, to get an answer. 400, choose 20. Something like that. It's not quite that. Anyway, it's big number. So I think it's fine the way you're doing it. Just don't rely on this hard edge to your space to say that's the limit.
Yeah. So maybe I guess
really
like looking at these models, we wouldn't really want to have like a hard cutoff of the mark here, but rather be like, yeah, I've already added like 500 points in my model now, so I can't really grow further in that direction unless I would like sparsify the model over here or something like that.
Maybe, yeah, something like that. It'll stop working well if you do this. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
The other thing is another point I want to make, and I don't know. Again, I'm not telling you to change any of this. It's just useful to think about it. The way you think about a column in V1, and it's getting input from some part of the retina, right? And it's detecting a bunch of these ganglion cells that are coming in, and those ganglion cells represent some area of the retina. Well, the very strong evidence throughout the brain is how many of those ganglion cells converge on a layer 4 cell in V1 is dependent on statistics of the environment. Imagine that the world only consisted of vertical and horizontal lines, and they were all perfect, and there was nothing else. It's just, you know, and so then the cell could say, look, I could get input from a whole bunch of ganglion cells at once, because the number of things I can represent n number of patterns on the retina, and there are very few patterns I'm encountering at my resolution. Therefore, I could look at a larger area of the retina and still work. If there's a lot of detail going on in the retina, that is a horizontal line or vertical line didn't extend very far, then if I start looking at a larger patch of the retina, all of a sudden I have a very complex space to try to interpret. And there's a lot, and then what it would do, it would narrow down the number of ganglion cells it gets. It would learn to expand its receptive field or contract its receptive field to match what it can represent. This is almost certainly happening in the brain everywhere. So we don't have to do it that way, but the limits are, it automatic dynamically updates what it's looking at based on, like, okay, I can't represent a bigger area, therefore I'm going to narrow down my focus. And that means that a V1 column could learn, if the inputs on the retina are very detailed, it means that the V1 column is going to learn smaller models. And if they were not detailed at all, it can learn much larger models, larger in space and smaller in space.
Okay,
you don't have to do it that way.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely think about if I can kind of incorporate that property.
Yeah, because you're putting these hard limits, like, oh, this is the size of the space, and this is the size of the pixel. I think the size of the space and how much of it we look at is really dependent on the statistics of the data.
Okay.
We're doing a K winner. We're doing a K winner on the in some sense, we're getting these axons coming in from the retina, and we're trying to put them through our spatial pooler, which is like a K winner type of pattern recognizer. And if there's very complex patterns there, then it'll narrow down its viewpoint. And if there's simpler patterns, it'll expand it. We actually modeled this early on at the Meta, so we know that works. But you don't have to do it that way. I'm just
I'll definitely think about if I can kind of incorporate that. Should be possible.
It's just a different way of it's being statistically limiting versus like some physical constraints of like, you know, space.
Yeah. So just now how it is implemented right now. Basically, here's an example where we have two learning modules. One has a larger low resolution model, one has a small high resolution model. So if we get input to both of these, let's say we moved along the cup, then learning module 1 would kind of be cut off at the moment when we go off the handle. Learning module 0 could learn all of it. We would get a bunch of observations, which are the gray points here. Each observation falls into one of these voxels. So we kind of count up how many observations fall into each voxel. That's supposed to be the colors in here. And then we take the k winners, and this will become the models for matching. And the step-by-step kind of thing is the very first observation that we get. We start at the center of the grid, so kind of the reference frame is kind of arbitrarily anchored to the first observation. And then everything else
when
is
you're saying
relative.
center here, so yeah, because there's an even number of,
there's no center.
then it's just this kind of slightly offset one.
Yeah. And then each model basically has a scale and an offset parameter that tells it how to map new locations into that grid. So every object model has kind of its own reference frame. And then, like I just mentioned, we count up all the observations in a cell, and we average the locations and features.
I don't understand this diagram. This grid represents what exactly?
Locations in space. So
but can't a point on the retina look at all locations in space? I can move my eyes around to see anywhere in space.
Yeah, so this is why this is all like this. Those observations were collected by moving over the handle of the cup.
But I'm not restricted. This column is not restricted to looking just at the handle. It can follow the handle to the cup and the rim of the cup. It can look at everything on the cup.
It did move also over the whole cup, but the other parts of the cup would be learned in different models in this case, because this learning module only learns small detailed models of objects. So that's this hard cutoff here. But, it did see more. It just is in different models.
This is an area that's very confusing to me. Not what you're presenting, but just in general, it's confusing. And so imagine the way I think about it. If you go back to your previous picture, the one that shows the two different large scale models, small scale models. Yeah, right, that's it, right there. Yeah. Okay, go to the next one again. Showing the dots.
This one?
Yeah. Well, either one, doesn't matter. So the way I view it is learning module 0 and learning module 1 are both seeing some subset of the cup, right? Because learning module 0 is going to see a bigger subset of the cup because of its resolution. Well, no, I just put that. No, I'll take it back. They're both moving over the cup. They both are pointing at some point in the cup at any point in time. And the pattern that can be recognized at any point is fuzzier and larger in 0, and it's smaller and more detailed in 1. And both learning modules can move over the entire cup, and they both can learn models of the entire cup potentially. But why wouldn't one learn a model of the entire cup? It goes back to the problem I said earlier. It's like the building. You're trying to represent a building with 1 centimeter scale. It's just too detailed.
Yeah.
So it's not clear to me how learning module 1. It's totally unclear to me how learning module 1 decides when to break a model and when to not break a model, when to say it's something else or not. It just doesn't. I don't know how that happens. And we talk about it as if it's like a binary break. It's like, oh, it's now moved from the handle and it's now onto the rim or something like that. I don't know if that's true. It seems odd that it would have some means for saying, well, it would be statistical. It would be something like saying, well, I'm learning this thing and these parts I can predict better than these parts or something like that. Anyway, I'm just pointing out that I don't understand this and I'm confused by it. I don't think it's a binary, like this is the scope of what learning module 1 can learn. It's going to be looking at the whole cup and trying to learn the whole cup all the time, just like a model that's looking at the house is trying to learn the whole house with a centimeter scale resolution, but it won't be able to. And so locally it'll be able to do okay. I just don't know how that breaking down into submodules or subcomponents would be implemented. It's not
Yeah.
going to be super hard like this.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, right now it's kind of just this hard cutoff whenever we go more than like 10 centimeters from the first observation to the left in this case, for example. But how I was kind of how I was kind of thinking is that basically, so learning module 1, after moving over the entire cup, it would have like 5 or 6 models that it learned of different parts of the cup, basically, because it kind of cut off and started a new model over here. And then over time, it would see many, many cups, and then it would kind of learn that it would kind of, there would also be a constraint on how many models a learning module can know about. So it would only store the repeating elements. So for example, the handle would be seen on many different cups. So that would be like a model that is persistent.
I agree.
But if we if we learn like a sub part of the corner where it attaches to the handle, that might be forgotten because it's never seen again like that.
Not often enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it would be helpful for me. I take a better picture here that would be less, I find it less sort of jarring or objectionable, would be to show learning module 1 and learning module 2 having the outer rectangles being the same size, projecting the entire cup in both learning module 0 and learning module 1, but then showing the resolution of learning module 1 is much finer, just like you've shown, that the grid is smaller. But there's something about learning module 1 that says it can't look at the whole cup. And so so it is observing the entire cup. It's just at this higher resolution. So in some sense, 0 and 1 have the same size outer rectangle. They're both looking at the entire cup as your eyes move. And then we say, like, okay, well, within those two larger rectangles, one at high resolution, one at low resolution, there's a limit to perhaps what a model could learn. And so a subset of that finer grid in LM1 would be what it could statistically learn. But to me, it's misleading just showing it like this. It's showing it like this, like the learning module 1 actually observes the entire cup, you know, and it's trying to learn the entire cup. It's trying. It's not like it's limited in space. It's just, it statistically can't do it. Like the building with 1 centimeter resolution. So that would be a better starting diagram for me. It would be the 2 large rectangles, different resolutions. And then we say, like, okay, each of these has a limit to statistically what it can learn. And perhaps in the learning module 1, it's going to hear some of the features it might learn that are statistically memorable. You follow what I'm saying? Yeah.
So then I guess with the learning module 1, it would be like this big grid, but at a high resolution. But then basically starting from this first observation, we can only add so many points in the vicinity of that until it kind of reaches its capacity.
Right. Well, to me, it's until it reaches its a statistical capacity, not some physical capacity. If, for example, there was only 1 cup in the world and it was always identical and never varied and something like that, it's possible that learning module 1 could learn the whole thing. It's like, yeah, it's always exactly the same. It's like, it's possible it could learn the whole thing, but because cups are different, and I don't know, there's a lot of variation in the world, it can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, if points are laid down not only as a function of space, but also as a function of feature change, then that would, yeah, naturally capture that.
Right. So I think, yeah, right.
Run out of points. I guess
the way the figure is you've drawn it's not wrong. It's just, for me, it was misleading.
Yeah.
And I interpreted it. So I would start off with 2. You think of it this way: they have 2 grids. One's fine resolution, one's not. And the sensor moves around from point to point in this grid. And in the fine resolution grid, there's just a lot of points defining a cup, and they're not going to be statistically, after you go a certain distance, they're going to start, you know, becoming statistically difficult to combine them together. And so it'll basically learn a model of a subset of that space. But it sees the whole space. It sees all of it sees the entire cup as the eyes move.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, one thing that's might be confusing here is like, this is not learning module 1. This is one model in learning module 1. Learning
Right.
module 1 isn't just this handle. It knows, it can know a lot more, and it can know about different parts of this mark.
Great, great. But I think the figure is misleading for me, maybe not for other people, because I didn't interpret that the way. Because
Okay.
you're showing the. All right, I interpreted
Yeah.
it differently. I interpreted that here's the cup, and these learning modules can learn, you know, this is what one can learn, this is what the other can learn, and this is only seeing the handle. But no, learning module 1
Yeah.
sees everything.
Yeah,
So
no.
that
I mean,
would be
I
helpful.
think it's, yeah, maybe it's helpful to clarify, like we did discuss, I think a while ago, having like a more organic, like building out of the model, where you like, yeah, start at one point and you just kind of, yeah, add points based on spatial distance and variance or whatever. But yeah, but you've implemented this for a good reason, I guess, Vivian, which is that like it needs to be computationally efficient, and doing this like structured like grid size is effectively very similar, but just can run more like quickly.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I guess you could introduce the graphs you have here on the right, which is kind of like conceptually what it's doing anyways, and then it just happens to be that that's like in this
Yeah.
3D voxel structure.
I'm
Is
not.
that
I'm not.
fair to
I'm
say,
not.
Vivian?
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's right, yeah.
I'm not objecting to the fact that you're showing LM1 having this smaller model, or even the way you're doing it. What I found objectionable to this figure is how I interpreted it. And I think it would be more useful if you started off by showing LM1. Oops, my battery's low. This new laptop still sucks. I'm going to be out of power here soon.
Maybe it's not a bad stopping point either.
Okay, but if you could do this, just humor me. Make the same diagram, show LM1 looking at the entire cup, just like the same size, looking at time, the outer rectangle is the same size, just higher resolution. And then you could highlight a subset of LM1 saying LM1 can't learn this entire model of this cup. It's too many points, or it's too statistically difficult to correlate the different size. You know, I have to look within some area which it can learn a model. Yeah. And then you could highlight what you've now shown lower. You could say, oh, it may learn a model of just a handle, or it may learn a model of just the rim, or something like that, as a subset of that larger picture. Yeah. That would be a helpful diagram for me. That would make it more consistent with the way I was thinking it, because it threw me off when you showed me this.
Yeah, that's good feedback. Yeah, I'll try and do that.
It's not changing anything you did. It's just a different way of presenting it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just. Yeah. That definitely. Just before wrapping up, I guess I would have like one more figure. That I think after that would be a good stopping point, if that's okay. If you guys have another
keep
minute.
Going. I don't know how long my laptop's going.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Just so this again is showing it's really drawn from the perspective of what's happening in the code, I guess, but basically just the kind of things that we keep track of. So we have observations coming in that are these gray points, and then we have kind of 3 representations of that. We have a count of how many observations fall into which voxel, and that count is used to do the k-winners. Then we have a grid that tells us the average location in each of these voxels. So that way, we don't just have like a very gritty looking model at the end, but we still kind of preserve some of this continuous location representation. And then we have the average features in each of these voxels. So for example, average color or average curvature or whatever features we have. And we to get the model that we use for matching, we basically take the average locations and average features, and then we threshold them by the k-winners of the count. So we take the, oh, did we lose Jeff? I think we lost him.
Oh, I think that was the battery.
Yeah. Anyways, that's basically it. So we take the k voxels with the most observations in them, and then store their average locations and features in the graph that we then use for matching. And that's like a real life example of the 2LM hierarchy, where we have like the larger, lower resolution model at the top, and then the smaller, higher resolution model at the bottom. And that's kind of the models that they have learned.
Yeah, cool.
And it sucks. It's just terrible. I can't stand it. The battery doesn't last. I can't see the keyboard, and it's got other problems. Like, oh my god. Anyway, so all right, I'm back. So you can continue.
Yeah, I just kind of finished up. But yeah, the only thing you missed was basically that we take the K voxels with the highest observation count and use the average location and feature stored in those voxels to build the model, the graph that we then use for matching, so for recognizing the object. And this is just a kind of real example of running this code on the 2LM hierarchy example, where we have the lower level learning module which learns like a smaller, higher resolution model, and then the higher level learning module which learns a larger, lower resolution model. And here the features can also store object ID that's passed on from this lower model, for example. That's all I said.
So this, this approach may work great. I don't know. This is one of those situations where I say, well, you don't have to necessarily have to do it the way the brain does it, but I don't know. Can't really
Yeah,
say
so I mean, the thing is, it's definitely not an improvement to what we had before, because, well, nothing is as good as just storing as much information as you want. We're basically limiting our models. But I think it will make it more interesting now, introducing hierarchy and actually learning compositional models. So I think,
right, because before you didn't need a hierarchy, right? Because
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, before we could do everything with one learning module, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah. I mentioned this before, I'll just mention it again. When we first did the columns paper, which was the first time we tested this basic idea of like, oh, locations and features and temporal pooling, because you got to do all those. We just did, I was worried about the capacity of it and how much, and we had fixed resources. We were doing it with a neural model, so we had a certain number of neurons, and we didn't increase the number of neurons or something like that. And I was surprised at how large the capacity was. It wasn't infinite, of course, but we got up to something like, 500 or 600 models of some modest complexity of like 200 locations each or something like that. It wasn't teeny. And so I was like, oh, okay. So, it's I don't know, let's see, 600 models times 200 points. That's, a fair number of location feature pairs. Anyway, so I just throw that out because it was one semi-empirical observation about the capacity of the system. It's not really accurate, but it was a test we did.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, basically, I mostly looked into making that change because without it, implementing hierarchy isn't very meaningful, because the detailed learning modules, the lowest level learning modules, can and will learn very detailed models of large objects.
Yeah.
So there's nothing forcing it to learn subcomponents of objects at the moment.
Right. I think though, if I were to, if I imagine I had a very detailed model, and now I move my eyes looking at the handle, and now I move to the other side of the cup. Well, we want to make a prediction of what we're going to see there. And if that prediction doesn't occur, then I assume my model's wrong. But again, if it's very detailed and I move a long distance, in the brain at least, the accuracy of my location after that movement is not very fine. It's going to be off. And it's going to be off enough that I'll say, oh, that was a misprediction. I'll have to start inferring again. Where if I move a little bit, it'll be good enough, and I'll say, oh yeah, that was the correct prediction. So it seems to me there's a practical, in any real system, there's a practical limit to how big you can build your models and still have them being predictive with movement. It's just not going to work. You know, the world isn't, our movements aren't that precise. So I think we would run into problems anyway, even if we didn't force it to. If I gave unlimited capacity to these models, you can still run into problems, it seems to me.
Yeah.
So we have to face this sooner or later.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the general approach that I kind of took for now, and I'm still working on the details and trying to make some improvements, and yeah, I have some more ideas of also, yeah, how to make it more efficient and all that. But